This is the AYANEO Flip DS, and I've been waiting for a handheld like this for an extremely long time. Not only is it a clamshell design, similar to handhelds like the Retroid Pocket Flip, which is instantly pretty appealing for a lot of people, but unlike most other previous clamshell emulation handhelds, it even has two screens, theoretically making it the perfect device for emulating DS, 3DS and Wii U titles, which just don't feel the same when they're played on a device with a singular display. But is this actually the ultimate device for dual screen emulation? And how is it with those standard single screen games too? Well, let's have a look. One of the single most untapped areas of the emulation hardware scene at the moment is that there are practically no devices dedicated to DS, 3DS and Wii U games. Considering the emulation software for these systems is extremely solid at this point, the main reason for this seems to be that getting good performance from 3DS games while also upscaling them, and playing Wii U games at all, requires pretty powerful hardware, which in turn makes it quite expensive, instantly making it more niche and thus not being viable for most hardware manufacturers to take a stab at. That is, until now. The AYANEO Flip DS is basically an almost comedically large 3DS that runs Windows 11 and works like a full-on PC connected to two monitors. Spec-wise, this thing is an absolute beast, with the version of the device we were loaned for this review having an AMD Ryzen 7 7840U CPU, 64 gigs of RAM, which is just completely overkill on a device like this, and a 2TB SSD. When you go to buy one of these for yourself, there's a degree of customizability with the CPU, RAM and storage, so the specs can vary from device to device. There's actually a version which has a Ryzen 7 8840U CPU, but from the comparisons I've looked at, the 7840U and the 8840U appear to be almost identical in power, so I don't really know why they even bothered letting you choose between the two CPUs. It might have just been better to have offered a single device with set specs, but hey, I guess some people like the customization element. What all of this actually means though is that we have a device here which is significantly more powerful than even the mighty Steam Deck, with it being on par with the power of the Lenovo Legion Go or the Asus ROG Ally, taking the AYANEO Flip DS right up there with the most powerful handhelds on the market. However, with great power comes great no, that's the wrong thing. With great power comes great cost. For the minimum spec model, the retail price is $939, and while you can get an offer at the moment by getting it through Indiegogo as an early adopter discount, these versions are limited, so I'm not really counting them. The max spec version brings us all the way up to $1,479, which is absolutely insane. For comparison, the Lenovo Legion Go and the Asus ROG Ally are both $699.99 and feature almost identical specs. So you're telling me that we're potentially paying an extra $780 just to have a second screen and more RAM? Listen, I want 3DS and Wii U emulation as much as the next guy, but that's a steep price to pay for something that I would only occasionally take advantage of. But let's leave that price point to the side for now, because maybe it turns out that this thing is just so good that it's actually worth it. But before we take a look at what this is capable of, I want to take a closer up look at the design and ergonomics on offer here, because this is where the initial attraction of this device definitely lies. When the Flip DS is closed, it basically looks like a massive brick, and it weighs about the same too, coming in at 650 grams, which is slightly heavier than the Steam Deck OLED, and it actually feels a lot heavier in the hands, because the weight isn't as well distributed as it is with the Steam Deck. When the screen is open, it sort of feels like your hands are constantly being tilted forward, which isn't ideal, but you do eventually kinda get used to it. I think this is the first time I've ever used a device that I would actually say is a bit too heavy, which is weird because I normally love it when handhelds have a bit of heft to them because I think it makes them feel a bit more premium. The analog sticks here are recessed into the shell, and while this obviously is a necessity so that the lid can fully close, it does end up getting in the way slightly. It just never quite feels like your thumb can sit right on the stick because it's constantly sort of resting on both the shell and the stick at the same time. To get a good grip, you need to angle your thumb down a lot more than you normally would on a standard controller. Other than that though, I do actually really like the feel of the other inputs. The D-pad and other buttons have basically no travel to them at all, but they're nice and clicky, and I think they feel a bit nostalgic in a way because they're pretty similar to how the Game Boy Advance SP and original DS buttons felt. The bottom of the device literally just features an audio input for connecting headphones, and the top of it has a micro SD card slot for expanding the storage, 2 USB-C ports, one for charging and another for connecting external devices, and finally we have an Oculink port which is used for connecting external GPUs. Of course, we also have the shoulder and trigger buttons, and I'm very happy with these. There's actually 4 shoulder buttons, with the standard L1 and R1 style ones, and then another pair which are further towards the middle of the device, which can be used as hotkeys for both emulators and navigating the device itself. The triggers here are analog too, and they don't go too far back when you fully press them either, so in general, I would say they feel pretty good. Now I know some of you might be worried about a clamshell design like this because of how easy it could potentially be to break it. However, this is a very sturdy device and the hinge on the screen feels insanely high quality. It's quite tight, which means you do need to apply a bit of force to actually get it open, but not in a way where it feels like you're snapping it, more so in a way where it feels like it's not going to close or even move around, even if you were to shake it around. The screen sort of gently falls into 3 set positions, one being almost completely vertical, the next being at the more optimal 45-degree angle, and the other at the full range of its motion when it's completely horizontal. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with everything we've seen here. I think you can tell that this is an extremely well-built product even before turning it on, and my only real complaint is about the analog sticks being embedded into the shell, which can't really be helped with this form factor unless they did something wacky like had removable sticks. But that would just make it more of a faff to set up, so I think they did all they could here. Now though, I want to take a look at what the setting up process is like. We're running Windows 11 here, so things should be pretty straightforward, right? Well, not exactly. Running Windows 11 turns out to be both a blessing and a curse. The positive is that basically every emulator and piece of software is going to be compatible with it by default. However, the disadvantage is that Windows isn't exactly optimized for touchscreen controls or a standard controller, and this makes navigating your way around and setting everything up feel a bit clunky. I was determined to try and get everything working without connecting any exterior hardware like a mouse or keyboard, and while it is possible, it's just not ideal. Doing anything slightly intricate like resizing windows, moving stuff from one screen to another, or even clicking on small icons can be extremely finicky with the touch controls. And even with the other control options at your disposal, like using the left stick to control the cursor or sliding around on this little nub to act as a mouse, it just doesn't feel all that intuitive. The thing is, there's not really anything AYANEO could have done about this beyond making their own OS or extremely sophisticated front end designed around a controller. But then you'd probably have issues with software compatibility, so sticking with the tried and tested Windows 11 was probably for the best. Seeing as the primary reason that you'd want to get the Flip DS is to emulate Wii U, 3DS and DS games, I think it makes sense for us to take a closer up look at what those consoles are like to play on here specifically. Starting with the Wii U, the emulator we're using is Cemu, and this is a reasonably straightforward piece of software to get up and running. Once you've got your games and update files formatted right and imported into the software, the only thing to change really is making sure that you're selecting the right patches and hacks to get the best performance. For example, with Breath of the Wild, I like to apply the FPS++ hack to make the frame rate more consistent and smooth than it would be otherwise. You'll also want to go into the options menu and separate the gamepad view, which will open up the gamepad screen in a separate window, allowing you to drag it onto the bottom screen and access it at any time. Then, when you launch a game in full screen, you're gonna have a great experience. But you'll probably notice that even when you're in full screen mode, the second screen will still be windowed, which is a little bit distracting. To fix this, you'll need to download some third-party software called Borderless Gaming. It's super simple to set this up, with you just launching the software in the background and then selecting the window you want to become full screen. In this case, it's obviously the gamepad view in Cemu. Once that's done, you've got a pretty awesome Wii U setup going on. The major issue at this point is going to be if you want to use gyro controls in any of your games. For some reason, this isn't very easy to get working, and even using AYANEO's pre-installed AYASpace software to configure this doesn't seem to yield great results. Even when I did get this working through AYASpace, it was only detecting left and right motions. Anything on the Y-axis was completely ignored, which basically makes it useless. Luckily, there is another piece of third-party software called Handheld Companion, which can help with this and configure the gyro settings a lot more effectively by mimicking a PS4 controller. Even with Handheld Companion though, the gyro controls still fell off. The first problem was that it was kinda working like a steering wheel, with me needing to rotate the device left and right to move the camera, rather than like on real hardware where you would actually move the device around as if you were aiming in 3D space. And the second problem was that the gyro was always slowly moving down a little bit, even when I was holding it completely still. Now, could you potentially fix this by diving deep into the settings and fiddling around with stuff even more than I already did? Yeah, maybe you could, but my point is that you shouldn't have to do that. What makes this issue even more irritating is that when I played 3DS games on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, a significantly cheaper handheld, the gyro controls literally just worked right out of the box. So why can't it just work here when you're paying upwards of $939? Moving on to 3DS games, and I have to say that the results here visually are absolutely unreal. Once again, you have to use Borderless Gaming to make the bottom window full screen and use Handheld Companion to activate the gyro controls, but after doing that you can upscale anything to 4 times the native resolution to bring it up to 1600 by 960, which is the resolution that most closely matches the 1080p display we've got here, and the results are gonna look stunning. This is by far the best 3DS emulation I've ever seen, and even with the somewhat clunky setting up with needing to configure third-party software and having to manually position windows where you need them to be every single time you launch the software because it doesn't seem to remember the positioning for some reason, it's kind of worth it in the end to get things looking this good and running this well. I think I'm actually more blown away by 3DS games here because the form factor of the Flip DS is perfect for emulating this console, and these games just look so amazing with the 4 times upscale. It's honestly quite transformative. Whereas the bottom screen is a little bit too small for Wii U games and is the wrong resolution, for 3DS games this bottom screen is actually super close to a perfect integer scale and is practically the same size as the bottom screen on an actual 3DS XL too. Moving on to original DS games now, and there's a really major problem that we encounter right out of the gate, which is that there's currently no DS emulation software which can separate the top and bottom screens into 2 separate windows. Now, you can get around this with another piece of third-party software called On-Top Replica, which basically allows you to manually select an area of your display and then rescale it to fit the screen. But quite frankly, this is way too difficult to set up on here without the use of an external mouse, and I don't want to use a mouse because it completely defeats the purpose of this being a portable system. Rather than messing about with On-Top Replica or trying to manually position the window so that it covers both screens, I would rather just play DS games as you normally would on a single screen device, which ultimately completely defeats the purpose of this being a dual screen system and removes a massive part of its appeal. The bottom line here is that while the hardware is amazing and I absolutely love the concept, the software side of things massively lets it down, both in terms of AYASpace lacking basic functions to facilitate 3DS and Wii U games in terms of gyro controls and removing the window from the second display, and in terms of the emulation software itself for the DS lacking the ability to split gameplay across multiple windows at all. But if we decide to ignore Wii U, 3DS and DS emulation completely, which to be honest would be a bit weird for us to do considering that's definitely the main reason that you'd want to buy this, is it still any good, and how is it with playing those single screen games? Normally I would go through loads of different systems and talk through the emulation capabilities in detail in these reviews, but there's not really much point in doing that here because in terms of performance, the AYANEO Flip DS can play anything upscaled to the equivalent of 1080p. Going straight into games that struggle on other devices like F-Zero GX for the GameCube, and as you can see here, it's upscaled to 1080p and it's running at a solid 60 frames a second with no issues. Even PS3 emulation is possible here, with Demon's Souls running amazingly at frame rates beyond what was even possible on the PS3 itself. In terms of PC games, I got things running even better than they do on the Steam Deck OLED, with the Resident Evil 2 remake running at 1080p on high graphics at a solid 60 frames a second. While Elden Ring was running at 1080p on high graphics and was sitting at above 30 FPS and probably could go higher if you lowered the graphics slightly. This is all impressive stuff, but it is all things that are possible on the ROG Ally and the Legion Go, so is there anything that the Flip DS can do that separates itself from the competition? Well, yeah. As I said before, the second screen on the bottom of the device is literally detected by Windows as a second monitor, which means that you can watch videos or listen to podcasts while you play a game on the main screen. Or maybe even better, you could have a guide on the bottom screen while you play through a particularly difficult section of a game on the top screen. This would probably only come in handy once in a blue moon, but having the option there to do this is pretty neat. The AYASpace software can also display a handy UI on the bottom screen, which gives you information about your TDP levels, fan speeds, CPU and GPU usage, and more. You can also find some customizable app shortcuts here and quickly make any window snap to the bottom screen too. This is probably the single most helpful thing that the AYASpace software enables, to be honest. This sounds pretty nifty, but with this form factor, the power on offer here, and the additional functionality provided by having two screens, comes a few massive caveats that might be enough to put you off of the device completely. First of all, this thing is loud, like it's really, really loud. The fan seems to be going bananas even when it's not using much power, and it's honestly a little bit distracting. Second of all, because the device is powering a hyperactive fan and is probably being used to play demanding games, it can also get extremely hot. This is to the point where it's actually a little bit uncomfortable to hold. It's almost a little bit concerning because the heat and the fan noise combined makes me feel like it's constantly on the verge of blowing up or something, and it just can't be healthy for it to be being pushed so hard like this all the time. Thirdly, because of the fan, the heat, and constantly having two screens on, this thing runs out of power pretty quickly. I left it on running Mario Kart 7 for the 3DS and it ran out of juice in only 2 hours. Now, this isn't the absolute worst battery life, don't get me wrong, but it's also not very impressive either. And finally, remember that for the max spec version of this, you're paying $1,479. Given all of the issues I've encountered here with the software and the problems with the hardware, I would say that that's a little bit expensive. So, after all of this, would I recommend the AYANEO Flip DS? I mean, no. Although it is a great device that's capable of a whole lot, I just can't bring myself to say that I recommend it, especially based on how expensive it is. If it was significantly cheaper, bringing it more in line with the Legion Go or the ROG Ally, then I would say maybe it was worth it if you're super enthusiastic about 3DS or Wii U emulation. But based on the price, I feel like you'd be better going with another handheld PC and using a single screen that's easier to set up. I'm giving the AYANEO Flip DS 5 dodos out of 10. Not only is it expensive, but it's also very reliant on third-party software to get things working optimally, which shouldn't be the case when you're paying such a premium for something like this. Everything should be working perfectly right out of the box. Other than that, it's quite loud, it gets very hot, the battery life isn't the best, the analog sticks aren't the most comfortable, and you could argue that the bottom screen is pretty small, especially when you're using it for Wii U stuff. On the other hand though, this is an incredibly powerful handheld that can emulate literally every retro system upscaled to 1080p while running at perfect frame rates. And it can even play a variety of games from newer systems like the PS3 and Wii U. Obviously, it's also great for modern PC games too, but it will be super loud and hot while tackling that stuff. I think that this type of dual screen emulation device is something that's eventually going to be really popular. However, this particular version of that concept is just a little bit too early to the market, and it ends up feeling like a prototype of things to come rather than a fully fleshed out device in its own right. Don't get me wrong, it is good, and in particular situations it might even be great, but there's just too many little issues present that all build up to make the price tag seem nuts. But what do you think of the AYANEO Flip DS? Do you like the look of it, and do you think we're going to be seeing more of these dual screen emulators in the future? Also let me know, if you got your hands on one of these, what game would you be most excited to play? For now though, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more retro goodness coming to your screens very soon. Remember to check out our book, A Handheld History 88 to 95, which is now available to pre-order. Also consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get access to some Dodo goodies. Links to all of that stuff will be in the description. But for now, I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.